We are going to talk about macromolecules. So macro is large. So we're going to be talking about large molecules. There are 4 groups of large molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We'll start off with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are organic molecules. So organic means that they contain carbon. They also contain hydrogen and oxygen, and do so in a ratio where there's, for every 1 carbon, there's 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. The building blocks of carbohydrates were the monomers, mono being 1 or single. The monomers of carbohydrates are called mono, again, mono being 1, and saccharide being sugar. So 1 sugar is a monosaccharide, or a monomer of a carbohydrate, a larger molecule. A few examples of monosaccharides would be glucose, fructose, and galactose. If you notice, all 3 of those molecules have the same chemical formula. They have the same chemical formula. They have 6 carbon, they have 12 hydrogen, and they have 6 oxygen. But they're 3 separate molecules because they arrange their carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a very different way, making them all taste completely different. If you were to taste all 3 of them, you could distinguish the differences because of their arrangement. When these monosaccharides or subunits join together, and we have poly or many sugars, we call them polysaccharides. So for example, if I were to join glucose to glucose to glucose to glucose to glucose, I would end up with many glucose, so many monomers bonded together. So that would be a polysaccharide. Remember, every time we bond 2 monomers together, we have to remove a water molecule, and that is known as dehydration and synthesis, because we're putting 2 things together. So a dehydration synthesis reaction. Now with carbohydrates, there are the occasion where we will have a double sugar. So instead of having many, we're just going to have 2 sugars bonded together. For example, we might get a glucose to connect with a fructose. And this actually gives you the most common sugar, sucrose. This is just typical white table sugar. In that case, we're dealing with 2 or di sugars, 2 sugars. So sucrose would be an example of a disaccharide or 2 sugars. Right up here, you see the chemical combination. You have 2 separate, so 1 monomer and a second monomer, both monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. When they join together, they form a new molecule, that's sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. It's a di. Again, di is 2 sugars. Polysaccharides. So if you look at the image below, you have 1 glucose, 2 glucose, 3 glucose, 4 glucose, 5 glucose. This is many. And so we would call this a polysaccharide. This in particular is a polysaccharide known as starch. And starch would be found, for example, if we were to take a look at, let's draw a couple leaves over here. And then we'll draw the roots. If you think about a potato, for example, down here underground, you have some potatoes growing. These potatoes store starch. Starch is also known as a complex carbohydrate because it's complex because it's many. There's multiple monomers joined together. And so when the plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air and it takes in water from the ground, you see that it can take its carbon and it can take the hydrogen from water and the oxygen from the carbon dioxide, and it will rearrange that into a sugar. Now, rather than storing just a single glucose sugar, what will happen is it'll make a sugar and it'll bond it to another glucose, to another glucose, to another one, and it'll keep bonding these together, making these super long chains or complex carbohydrates. And that gets stored as starch in the potato. And that's why you eat potatoes, is to get starch. You can break these down a little bit at a time, get energy over a long period of time. So right here, if we were looking at one single sugar, we would call that a monomer, or a monosaccharide in this case. When we look at the whole group together, for example, I'll change color here just so we can distinguish between, but when we look at the whole chain, all these monomers joined together through dehydration synthesis, excuse me, then we have many, so we have a many sugars, polysaccharide. Now, carbohydrates have a very important function for us, and that is, first and foremost, they are our energy source. So when we eat carbohydrates, we readily break those bonds down, and we get energy from the carbohydrates. It converts. We have the ability to change this into ATP, which gives us, boom, energy. Now, animals are going to store carbohydrates a little different than plants. If we're talking about animals, so right here we're talking about animals. Animals store glucose in the form of a polysaccharide called glycogen. And so glycogen, you're going to need to know the difference between glycogen, which is found in animals. We store this mainly in our liver and in muscles. Muscles, because if you think about where do we have to do work? Okay, we do work. We need energy. It's going to be in our muscles. And so it's a pretty quick source of energy for us. It's what gets converted down pretty easily into ATP. In plants, they don't do as much work. So plants, however, they have to grow real tall. So in order for the tree to grow real tall, there has to be something very rigid and hard structure in there. And so plants actually have around their cells, so here's the cell, they're going to have this extra cell wall. That cell wall provides extra support, and so this is the cell wall. That cell wall provides extra support, and the carbohydrate in there that does so is known as cellulose. Cellulose is found in the cell walls of all plant cells. We can eat cellulose, however, we don't really break it down for energy. Cellulose gets turned into what we know of it as dietary fiber, just helping to keep us regular. If you look at where do we get our carbohydrates? Well, the main source of carbohydrates that give us this longer term energy, kind of we break it down over a period of time, those would be our polysaccharides. And so when we're thinking of polysaccharides, we're thinking of complex carbs. Complex carbs. This will be long term. This is what we're going to want to take in the night before a big event. This would be whole grains, breads, cereal, pasta, potatoes. Our disaccharides are going to be our basic. When we think of sugar, this is what we think of. These are in our candies, in different sugary cereals. This is what we're As an American culture, we're pretty addicted to. And then finally, the sugar in the simplest form, the sugar that's most readily available to turn it into energy quickest, would be our monosaccharides. For example, you could find that in honey, in cane sugar, and some dairy products also will have monosaccharides, although most dairy products are actually going to be lactose, which is actually a disaccharide. And so that's the carbohydrates. The next group of macromolecules that we're going to look at are lipids. Lipids are also known as our fats. So you're going to find those in things like butter, in oils, avocados, some meats, olives, different foods like that will find our fats. And we need fats because fats are actually really important for us. Lipids, or fats, are very large nonpolar molecules. So if you think back to the lab we did, they're nonpolar. So they do not mix with water. They don't like water. They are, for the most part, hydrophobic. They have a high ratio of carbon and hydrogen. So even though fats are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, there's very little oxygen, and most of the molecule is going to be carbon and hydrogen. If you take a look up here at these two fatty acids, one is a saturated, meaning all of the carbon on the chain has as many hydrogen as possible, and one is unsaturated, meaning right here you're going to see this carbon, it has a double bond, causing this kink. Now the difference here is going to be the saturated fat would be like in butter. Okay, it's going to be a solid at room temperature, whereas the unsaturated, they're going to be soft. They'll be your oils even, so liquid. They're going to be more liquid at room temperature. These are fatty acids, and fatty acids, so a fatty acid is actually the monomer, the building block of a lipid. These are long branches of carbon attached to hydrogen, so we call them carbon, hydrogen, or hydrocarbon chains. There's a couple different types of lipids. One type would be the triglyceride, tri being 3. And so a triglyceride is a molecule that has 3 fatty acids joined to a glycerol head. So I would have a glycerol head, and I would have 1, 2, 3 fatty acids coming off of it. And the fatty acids are going to be like right over here. They're going to be these big chains of hydrogen and carbon. You can have saturated and unsaturated. Another type of lipid that is super important, that surrounds every single cell in your body, is a phospholipid. Phospholipids make up the cell membrane around every cell in your body, and it does so by forming this double layer. So you have a phospholipid. It has a phosphate head, which is hydrophilic, loves water, but then it has these 2 fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic, and they don't want to be around water at all. And so what happens is this hydrophilic head, which is like right here and right here, protect the hydrophobic inners by forming 2 layers. And when you get this protection and it forms this ball, you have this, basically you have a cell. And the outside is the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is a phospholipid. It's a bilayer of fat. A couple other lipids, just really quick. Waxes. For example, inside your ears you have wax. Waxes provide waterproof characteristics. And another type of lipid is the steroids. 2 particular would be testosterone. It's what allows men to lay down muscle and grow hair.